Yes, so some of my fascination with the topic of magic when I started to study it, and all coming out of this Dunhuang manuscript that I worked on back in 2004 and then returned to about 10 years later. My fascination with the topic came from the fact that I'd read so much about Buddhism that didn't touch on this topic at all, that kind of erased magic from Buddhism. And there are various ways that Western research has done that. One of the ways is to present Buddhism as just a philosophy. So I suppose in some ways with the good intention of promoting Buddhism in the West and promoting it as a respectable academic topic, Buddhism was presented as not a religion but a philosophy. And in order to do that, you had to take everything that was considered superstitious or ritual and put it to one side, and then really focus on the canonical texts, especially the philosophical ones, what were considered the earliest teachings of the Buddha, the ethical teachings, and anything that looked suspiciously like magical practice, that must be something that was added later on or was just a local tradition, not really what the Buddha taught. So there's I'd say quite a long period of from the 19th century onwards of creating an idea of Buddhism in the West, both in popular Buddhism and in the academic study of Buddhism, which made it a very sort of clean philosophical tradition without any of this this kind of complicated ritual and magical content. So if we look at, you asked about the Prasena divination, for example. When we look at Buddhist society, so this particular divination practice that you're talking about, it's one where a child is asked to look into a mirror or another reflective surface, and in there they'll see a vision, and then the person who is carrying out the ritual will question the child about what they see, and that from those visions then the answer to the questions will come forth. And in Tibet, the Prasena ritual, where it's mainly just known as pra, became really important and was an important part of selecting the Dalai Lama's rebirth. So really kind of fundamental to the to Buddhist society practice in Tibet. And also it was used for many other things, many other kinds of divination. And it was done by lamas generally, so it was very much part of the skills of a Buddhist lama. Absolutely, there's something about the seeing a reflection or looking into a crystal that kind of seems to activate a kind of visionary aspect in our minds. But what I found fascinating, you mentioned John Dee, but there's another writer who I talk about in the book who, in the 11th century, who actually gives an account of, as a child, he was asked to partake in this practice where he looked into a shiny surface, I think in a bowl of water is mentioned, and then was questioned by the priest about what he saw. So the whole of the Prasena practice is right there, also in England in the 11th century, and that's something that we can't quite explain, but it's a fascinating connection. So rainmaking, I think, probably is, if you think about the importance of agriculture, of crops, of the fact that in order to have a stable kingdom, you have to have a stable income, and the people have to be able to eat, and so on. So rainmaking really is so fundamental for a ruler to keep a kingdom kind of secure and safe. And if they can promise that, then hopefully the people will be happy with them. So you can see in a sort of that abstract sense why rainmaking would become part of kind of court ritual and become part of the ruling classes ritual practice. And you can see why, again, it's something that's spread so far. So something that is quite well known is that the Empress Wu in China ordered many copies of the Mahamegha Sutra, the rainmaking sutra, copied, and it's sometimes said that this was to glorify herself as a kind of Buddha, but it's also part of that, as I've said, the ruler, if the ruler can guarantee prosperity and rain, then they should be a successful ruler. And that very much went to Japan, where it became part of the royal court rituals in Japan as well. So there's a few different deities associated with rainmaking. One of the most important is Avalokiteshvara, also in his form as Amoga Parsha, who is the deity who wields a noose. The other deity that's really important in the Indian and the Tibetan tradition is Garuda, actually. So the bird, the mythical bird deity, indeed, who is associated with success in agriculture, but also bringing of rain. So there's an Indian Dharani Sutra called the Iron Beak Sutra, which is all about rituals around Garuda, and these are these sort of early kind of pre or proto-tantric rituals where you create a mandala by putting arrows into the ground and tying ribbons and so on, and then you create through this you create a ritual space where the nagas are subdued. And the nagas in India are another kind of mythical being that's very much associated with lakes, rivers, and with rain, so with everything water, basically. So the reason why Garuda is the kind of rainmaking deity is that Garuda can, with his iron beak, subdue the nagas. So if you see images of Garuda, often in the claws of the bird there is a snake, or a naga, in fact. So so rainmaking, we find this in India and Tibet especially. The bird figure of Garuda is very important. So there is always a tension there, of course, and it's not always resolved. So especially if you look at the tantras, so the Buddhist tantras in Vajrayana kind of grew up out of and around the magical traditions. I mentioned the mandalas that we used in rainmaking. Essentially with tantric practice, with the Vajrayana, this kind of ritual technology was adapted to the Buddhist aim of enlightenment. So instead of a mandala being for making rain or subduing spirits or nagas, the mandala was to create a perfect representation of reality in which the deity is at the center, and so on. So the tantras kind of, if we look at things like the Gurya Samaja Tantra, the Sava Durgati Parishodhana Tantra, they combine these kind of very practical magic spells with this very elevated aim of enlightenment. So all of this that's found in many of the tantras was practiced in the monasteries, or in, as you say, possibly in cave temples. But equally, Buddhist monks really went out into the communities that they worked with, and they performed services, and these were medical and magical. So the kind of low magic that you mentioned, I don't think Buddhist practitioners, Buddhist monks really had any concern about providing those services. So it could be for very simple things like persistent headaches or eye infection and so on, as well as providing, teaching the Buddhist teachings or reading the sutras and so on. In fact, if you look at the grimoire from Dunhuang, some of the more, I suppose, the kind of magic you're talking about, clairvoyance, invisibility, they actually do come in the context of a tantric Vajrayana practice. So the spell book itself is divided into sections around the practices of Avalokiteshvara and other deities, including the wrathful goddess Prakriti. So in that section on Prakriti, which involves some of the more kind of wrathful magic, it does say you have to have recited her mantra a number of times. You have to have done enough of the practice of the deity in order to do these magical spells. So it isn't just a case of you will pick up the book and look it up and do it, but it actually comes in the context of that kind of tantric Vajrayana practice. I think one of the things I wanted to highlight writing about Buddhist magic was, or at least to undercut the idea of Buddhist monks and nuns as being living in monasteries, reading sutras, doing meditation, and that being the sort of the whole picture, and also interacting with the lay community only in the alms round, going around and collecting offerings and food. So what, when you look at Buddhist magic, what that does for a start is to make you think about, well, if the monks and nuns were learning these magical and medical practices, what were they for? Were they just doing them for each other, or were they providing them to others? Were people coming into the monastery? Would a pregnant woman come to a nunnery to receive some medical practice or some magical practice to protect her baby? Would a sick person be brought into the monastery to be cared for with the magical practice, to have mantras recited over them? Or would the monks or nuns go out and visit people in the town and provide these practices? So I see magic, this topic, as kind of permeating or making porous that distinction between the world of the Buddhists and the lay people, between the sacred and the ordinary. It helps us to kind of break down that idea of monks and nuns of just living in the world of scriptures and meditation, but actually they had to live in the real world. They had to interact with ordinary life. And we can trace back some of those influences to very early ritual traditions in Buddhism. For example, in the book I mentioned, the Tanatiya Sutra, which is an early sutra which exists in the Pali Canon as well as in Sanskrit, and is found in fragments in Central Asia as well. And this is a text for protection, and it's a text where the Buddha offers protection from yakshas and other kinds of beings. And it, as far as we know, it goes back to the earliest phases of Buddhism, along with other Pali texts. So that kind of world of ritual practice for protection is right there in the earliest phase of Buddhism. And we have to also acknowledge that those protective texts had an element of violence in them, because you can't protect people from yakshas without kind of a wrathful kind of face towards them. So already in the Tanatiya Sutra and other similar early texts, there's a sort of wrathful element. So when we talk about wrathful deities in the tantras, actually there's a long history for that. When you look at healing traditions, that really in any pre-modern culture, it's very difficult to make a distinction between magic and medicine. And people use phrases like magico-medical or medico-magical rituals, because there simply is no way of disentangling them. As you said, some remedies that we find are things like making up a paste of sesame seeds and so on, and there's a very kind of practical nature to it. On the other hand, when the paste is administered, the mantra of Avalokiteshvara is recited. So suddenly there's a kind of a spiritual or magical element to the practice. In some cases, a medical practice might involve exercising a spirit, a negative influence. In that case, usually, at least in the West, we would consider that a fully kind of magical practice. Buddhism, especially though, as it seems that from really early in the history of Buddhism, Buddhist monks were associated with medical practice. That it really, very early in India, that people were coming to Buddhist monks and asking for help with medical issues. So it really, the medical tradition in India actually grew up alongside Buddhism. And Buddhists were always there, in that sense, to provide medical services for lay people. Yes, so the medicine Buddha is an obvious one and an interesting case of some of the things we've talked about in terms of medical and magical practice coming into Vajrayana, and obviously the medicine Buddha is also a Buddha that could be part of a kind of deity yoga practice where the practitioner is the medicine Buddha. But I would say perhaps even more than Vaisajya Guru, the medicine Buddha, it's Avalokiteshvara and his kind of compassionate role that really embodies the medical tradition, the magical medical tradition in Vajrayana Buddhism. So at an earlier stage, it seems that Avalokiteshvara was often associated with eye medicine specifically, which is interesting because actually his name is usually interpreted as the one who sees the sufferings of sentient beings. So in fact, in the Dunhuang Grimoire I studied, there are the section on Avalokiteshvara contains several remedies for eye problems, cataracts, and so on. So there's an association there for Avalokiteshvara, but far beyond that, because as I said, he is so much associated with compassion. The medical tradition, kind of the medical rituals cluster around him, and he's really probably the most important for those. For example, the Mahamayuri, the great peacock, queen of spells, was originally a Dharani spell, and we can see scholars have shown that in the development of that Dharani practice, she became kind of personified as a goddess. There's a sort of, I think at least for educating Western Buddhists, I think there's a benefit to knowing that some of the things I've been saying about these practices going back right to the beginning of Buddhism, that they can't just say, oh, those were just local practices, or those were just added by some greedy monks or something. But these are really part of Buddhism, part of the heritage that as Western Buddhists that they are kind of they are inheriting, and they really need to take it a bit more seriously and respectfully, and understand the full rich kind of variety of Buddhist practice that has come down to us today.